Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England, and we're now on part 3 of a multi-part series of the IC Cards game. I'm now taking you the next step. You really do need to watch videos 1 and 2 to understand what we're doing here as we're moving forward with this. But now we're going to get to some relatively complex parts of this. A good understanding of the base of what I'm trying to do here and how I'm actually changing the program is very important. Let's first look at the actual application. It is running. And again, it shows, now in this case it shows 3 baseball fields, but that's because I'm actually generating these random. If I click on any one of these cards, you'll actually see that the card will change, which is part of the game. If I click on the card and it doesn't change, well, that's because it changed back to the original card it had. That's just something about checking, and that's actually something that will be handled later on as we work through this. But now let's look at how this is done. Well, first things first, if we go to the HTML, I have added this onClick. And onClick is going to call a JavaScript function called newCard, and it's going to pass the ID of the span where that card is going to go. But really, I've made major changes now to the JavaScript. So let's look at those major changes. Well, first thing is that if you're a programmer, you really want to work in an object-oriented environment. JavaScript really doesn't directly support objects, but it allows you to create things like objects. Okay, so we are going to create something like an object. So I'm going to make this thing called a card. Now I'm defining it as a function, but this function also has properties. In other words, by defining this function and defining this dot name equals name and this dot image equals image, I can create a new card by passing over these four variables. So a card has a name, it has an image, it has an X index and a Y index. And the X index and the Y index is where it actually exists on the image. So I then use the this, which is a reference to the object, and I set this.name equal to the name. So now I can actually reference the card by name by actually using card.name, or the actual instantiation of that card.name, which is kind of nice. Okay, I've now also got a function. This background position is actually going to be a function, and what it does is it takes the X offset and the Y offset, okay, the X offset and the Y offset, and it makes a string out of them, which is what you would see in the CSS. And you've looked at that before if you've watched the other videos. Because now what I've done is I've taken those offsets and I've put them inside of an array. Now that array also sits within basically a variable, which is a variable that is an object style variable, image1. Because image1 has an X offset array and a Y offset array called X offset and Y offset, and a source, which is where the file is. So those are referenceable by the image1.xOffset and image1.yOffset. But remembering that xOffset returns an array, we can actually look at the index of that xOffset and we can get the string, which is the X position of that card in the big image file. Because remember, that card sat within a large image file. Okay, and just to give you an idea what that image file looks like, here it is. That's that image file. So what I'm doing is I'm actually pulling those cards from an image file. This is kind of important. This ability to create object-like constructs is important. And I've shown you 2 examples. One, which I've used a function, and the this operator. And what this is actually doing is using what's called a prototype, which we're going to cover a little bit more in detail later on. But it allows you to prototype a function that behaves like a method within an object, which is actually the card and the function card. Okay, so the function is making this look like an object. And then I have this also what looks like an object, except that all it has is properties. And this is an instantiated object because it is declared as a var. Var image1 equals. So image1 is an instantiated object. Now, moving down a little bit, I also create an array of the cards. And in this case, what I do is I instantiate, because I have an array called cards, I can now make integer indexes, 0 through 6. I'm just going to put 6 cards up, and I pass to that function the name, like in this case the airplane, image1, image1. Now image1 encapsulates everything about that image. It has the offsets of where all the cards are, the X and the Y, and the source. This is good programming practice. You should encapsulate what goes with an object within the object. So this defines what you need to know about that image. Where's the source of it, and where's the X and Y offsets for each of the individual cards. So I passed it that image, the new card is passed the image, and then the index of where that card is in those two arrays, which is 0, 0. So the X offset is the X offset of 0, the Y offset of 0, and this is nice because I can now instantiate very easily a bunch of cards. Now let's bring those cards back up. If you look at the cards, you'll see that in position 0, 0, okay, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 0, 1, you have different card pieces, and that's actually what I put in here. So I've got the airplane, ambulance, balloons, baseball field, billboard, cemetery, and chicken, each with the indexes that go with that. Different way of pulling that information and bringing it onto the screen. Now, the next thing I need to do, remember, I call on the body on load up here. I call load cards. Load cards now still uses the same function, set card. Only now you're passing it the C1, which is where the span that you're going to put the card in. And now the cards with an integer. And the integer is actually going to be returned by a function, getRandomInt, 0 through 6. I'm using getRandomInt 0 through 6 because I've got cards between 0 and 6, but I didn't use a defined function because I'm going to change the number of cards in the game as I go along. So I'm going to keep these variables. The set card does the same thing it always did. It gets the element by the ID, so there's the span. It sets the background image equal to the card background image, and the background position equal to the background position. But now, those are coming from this specific function, which is encapsulated inside of this function. So when I create a card inside the array as a new card, I can reference the function background image as card.backgroundImage, as the card that was passed to the function, which is one of the cards in the array. And it's going to be in random because they're randomly indexed by integer. The last two functions I'll show you are the new card. New card was called up here when I clicked on one of the cards. And it also uses set card with the element ID passed over for the element that was clicked, and the getRandomInteger 0 through 6 there. GetRandomInt is simply a function that returns a random integer, and that's one that you can GetRandomInt with a min and a max. It just uses the math functions to return a random integer back. So now I've got these cards that I can click on and they'll change. So I'm getting very close to being able to do some very fun things with my game. So hopefully you understood all the parts that were in here. We're now getting into some fairly advanced JavaScript programming, but if you want to get into the power of it, you've got to get into the advanced functions, and that's where we're headed. Thank you very much, and good programming.